Well, thank you so much. Many thanks to Carol and to her team at the Skyscraper Museum. I'm delighted to be back. I wish I was in person, although it's nice to be able to have such a large audience with us today, which we probably couldn't fit so well in the museum. New York, of course, is a city whose skyline is defined by tall towers and tall buildings. And while many of these buildings are gleaming, shiny structures of steel and glass, the architecture of antiquity was also an important element of many early skyscrapers. And so today what I want to do is talk about why the architecture of antiquity, and by that I mean ancient Greece, Rome, as well as Egypt and the ancient Near East, were important to the creation of some of New York City's most important buildings, but also to some of New York's important tall buildings, some of its famous skyscrapers and some of its less known ones. So this project comes from the work that I've been doing recently, which Carol mentioned, Classical New York, which I was here with my colleagues John Ritter and Matt McGowan to talk about a few years ago at the Skyscraper Museum. Tonight I'm going to talk about the most recent research I've been doing, and this is Antiquity in Gotham. And this is basically looking at how ancient architecture is a vital part of New York City. Now, like most things in my life, this stems from a chance encounter. So as a kid, I spent a lot of time in the American Museum of Natural History. I have a mother who's an ornithologist, so you get dragged in to look at things in museums quite a lot. But we lived in Connecticut. I would like to point out I was born in New York, but left for the suburbs in when I was 4, but managed to get back here eventually. And for that, I'm very grateful. But I spent a lot of time in this museum, but we always drove into the bowels of the museum, parked, and kind of went off into the collections. And I kind of drew while my mother, photographed bird skins. So I moved back to New York City after 10 years abroad. And I moved back actually now just about 10 years ago. And I was out walking because I love to walk in cities. I feel it's the only way to actually experience and really start to understand a city. And this was a city, New York I had experienced as a child, as a student working here in the summer, but never really lived here. So I was out walking in Central Park, and I kind of went from the east side where I lived and popped up on the west side and was met with total shock when I saw the Central Park West facade of the American Museum of Natural History, which is the New York State Memorial to Teddy Roosevelt. And literally I blurted out loud, who stuck the Arch of Constantine to AM&H? Because it was so clear to me that this building in fact was tacked on here. I could immediately see the columns, I could see the triple bayed arches. The datations here on this early 4th century monument were replaced by Lewis and Clark, Audubon and Boone. There was an inscription. There's an inscription. There were circles that had the seal of New York and the seal of the United States, replacing the tandi that showed the emperor doing various things like sacrificing or hunting, things that emperors do. So I was really, really confused to see this building. And that's always a good sign, I think, if you're an academic. If you have a question that doesn't have an immediate answer, you generally have a research project. And so to me, what was so surprising, or what I couldn't understand, was why would a 4th century arch, and this is an arch that celebrates the victory of Constantine at the Mulvian Bridge. It's a victory over a civil war. And it's totally straight up about that, which is very odd in Roman art. And it's the famous battle that Constantine is supposed to have had a vision of Christ and written Cairo on his shields, and then was victorious. But so what I couldn't figure out was, why was this monument such a good model for a monument that was that there was a design competition for in 1920 to commemorate Teddy Roosevelt after he died, who had been, of course, a much beloved president and famous son of New York. And so I was really confused by this question. And so that question then started to deepen, because as I walked around New York City, I just kept seeing things that struck me as very odd. If New York was supposed to be such a modern city with modern architecture, quote unquote, whatever that means in a way, then why were there loft buildings in the West 30s that had Neo-Hittite architecture, which you can see there? Why was there an arch in Brooklyn to commemorate Civil War veterans that was modeled on the Arch of Titus via the Arc de Triomphe? And then why were there pyramids in Brooklyn? And so to me, these questions kind of lingered, and I wondered, why were they all here? And so the question I started to ask myself was, why antiquity? And in some ways, this starts with the very creation of the United States. Since the US inception, classical antiquity, and to a lesser extent, ancient Egypt and the ancient Near East, have been powerful models for American art and architecture because of the flexibility, diversity, and potence of meaning that these forms carried. Classical antiquity is not monolithic. It is flexible, it is fluid, and it is endlessly mutable. And so as a result, the legacy of the classical world is also like that. So Greece and Rome, of course, were seen as the originators of Western civilization. But the political, philosophical, and intellectual traditions of the classical world, specifically the concepts of tyranny and good governance, were core to the founding fathers' arguments supporting the Revolutionary War. Now, at the same time, what's interesting is not only were New Yorkers and Americans looking to these forms, but they did also look to some of these other forms, so Egyptian forms as well, because Egypt had a sense of being of building architecture that was eternal, because man, those pyramids are old, as is the Sphinx, as are obelisks, and so there was a kind of Egypt was seen to have a very long history, as well as being very technologically advanced. Building the pyramids, building the Sphinx with no steel, it was truly a remarkable undertaking. And so when I started to get interested in these questions of looking at ancient architecture, I thought we shouldn't just think of them as classical, because not all of the forms are classical. But in fact, if we use this idea of neo-antique, which I developed with my colleague Catherine von Stackelberg, it would allow us to kind of compare and contrast. So is Egyptian used for one thing? Is ancient Near Eastern used for something else? Is Greece and Rome used for a bunch of different things? And the answer was it allowed me to look at buildings in a different way and compare notes across different styles, and to see where many architects or patrons or tastemakers saw antiquity as a kind of interesting treasure trove of different ideas, as well as different forms that could be kind of picked and chosen and applied in buildings in an effective way. So it's not surprising that some of our earliest buildings in New York City, I'm sure a building that many people in the audience are familiar with, the US Customs House, better known as Federal Hall. This was finished in 1842, and of course is one of the most important early civic buildings in the United States and in New York. Of course, it is an anchor on Wall Street. Here you see it today, directly next to the Bankers Trust building, which I'm going to speak about in a moment. But it's a very important early building because it kind of sets a certain tone. It means that civic architecture should be important. It should be grand. It is also modeled on antiquity. It is modeled on the Parthenon, probably the most famous temple from the Greek world. The Customs House was also, of course, very important. In the 19th century, the main source of revenue for the federal government were the tariff duties placed on imported goods. By 1852, 95% of the federal government's revenue came from tariffs, and 80% of that came from New York City. And so this building symbolizes the financial power of New York City, but also the kind of fact that the United States would now have institutions that would have a history, and institutions that would last for a very long time. So not only do we have buildings like this, but we also have many of these charming little temples. You will see many of these still floating around various neighborhoods in Manhattan. If you actually just start looking for small temples that were once banks that have been converted into something else, you'll find that they turn into CVS's or Walgreens, or there's still sometimes banks, savings locations as well. This is the Phoenix Bank by Martin Thompson that was built in the 1820s, although the date is not quite clear. When here you have another building where a little temple, which is a solidly built building, would show kind of this ideas of, solid financial strength in these buildings. Temples were really some of the ruins that survived very well from antiquity. And so taking these forms that were well known and recognized and then using from the banks kind of gave the bank an authority of, of financial security, of cultural gravitas. And of course, the other thing is these forms all have a European association. And, the United States and New York might have had a minor chip on its shoulder about being culturally inferior to Europe. And so by using some of these forms, appropriating these forms, New York says that it is as good and as powerful and as culturally rich as London, Paris, or say Milan or Rome. So when the idiom of the skyscraper appeared, it's not really surprising in certain ways that classical forms and European architectural forms are adapted. And so let's start with the Bankers Trust building. Now, I'm sure as many people know in this audience, skyscrapers were often compared to being like columns. Actually, Louis Sullivan talks about that, but he also makes the point that the tripartite division of kind of base, shaft, if you will, and then top doesn't really, it doesn't really derive from a classical column, and he's undoubtedly right about that. But one thing that Sullivan disliked intensely was the fact that many early skyscrapers used historical styles, whether it was classical, medieval, or Renaissance. And the Bankers Trust building is, I'm sure, one building that would have irritated him, but I think is particularly interesting and allows us to really understand how ancient architecture could be used for a skyscraper. So this is located at 14 to 16 Wall Street, so literally opposite the Customs House or the Federal Hall, and right kitty corner also to the New York Stock Exchange. It was set up for the Bankers Trust, which was a trust company that had was one of the, I may have been the first to have over $1 billion of assets in the early part of the 20th century. J.P. Morgan had a major hand in the Bankers Trust, and actually, of course, his headquarters were directly diagonally across from this building. And so the building kind of had two purposes. It needs to suit the functional needs of the Bankers Trust. It has to have office space, but it also has a symbolic purpose to kind of explain the purpose of the building, to speak to the successes of the Bankers Trust. So this was built by Trowbridge and Livingston, and it combined classical and Renaissance forms while using the most technologically advanced systems to create what was briefly the world's tallest building for about 2 seconds before the Woolworth building was built. So the skyscraper is just about 540 feet, and it has this kind of this tripartite division of base, shaft, and top. So the base kind of has a granite screen wall, but then on its kind of upper part of its base, in fact, has a colonnade of Ionic columns. And those derive from the Erechtheion. The Erechtheion, which you can see here, is one of the other most famous buildings from the Greek world. It's also located on the Acropolis. It's famous, of course, for its caryatid porch, but actually its Ionic order gets replicated a lot. I believe actually Jay Gould's tomb in Woodlawn also has the same capitals. It has very distinctive capitals at the upper level that you can identify. So if you're a classical archaeologist and you've studied Greek architectural orders, you can see when someone's using a very specific Ionic order. So it's referencing one of the most important buildings from the classical world. Now, the classical world, though, does not have a lot of tall buildings, although we'll get to the example up here where there is a tall building that's evoked. But to get the shaft form, Trowbridge and Livingston looked to St. Mark's and to the Campanile from Venice. And that's, I think, an interesting point, or one that's just worth mentioning for a fact, is that you could see this as a pastiche of, oh, I need some Renaissance, I need some classical, but it's actually, you can look at it as architects using different forms to find creative solutions to the type of building that they're building. And it certainly conveys the sense of being a strong, tall tower. Now, when we get to the top, things in my book get very interesting. So we have, again, the same type of Ionic colonnade. I think the colonnade is 5 stories high. And then we go back to a step pyramid on the roof. And the step pyramid is modeled on one of the most famous buildings from the ancient world, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Mausoleum of Carnassus, which was completed in about 352 BCE. So this was the grand tomb of King Macaulay-Lewis. This is where we get the word mausoleum from, of Carnassus, which is now Bodrum in modern-day Asia Minor or Turkey. Now, the mausoleum itself did not weather the vicissitudes of time well. You can see I have a model here, and that's because everything basically collapsed. We do know about the building from the ancient sources, from Vitruvius and Pliny the Elder. Vitruvius being very famous architect, of course, who wrote a book about the 10 principles of architecture, the 10 books of architecture, excuse me, and really kind of one of our first architectural treatises, really our first architectural treatise from the ancient world. But Pliny the Elder's description, he was writing in 75 CE approximately, is a little bit more helpful. But these sources, which were later read by artists and architects, kind of provide a lot of intellectual and artistic fodder. So we know the museum had, as a mausoleum, excuse me, had a triangular base and a big pediment. It then had a colonnade and then had a step pyramid roof up to a quadrigia. That's a chariot with 4 horses. And it was probably about 146 feet tall. So it was a very tall ancient building. It was adorned with famous statues created by famous Greek sculptors. But we know that the roof and the colonnade collapsed sometime after Antiquity. And the ruins were, though, reasonably intact until 1494, when the Knights Hospitallers used the stones of the mausoleum to fortify their castle at their castle of St. Peter at Bodrum. And by 1520, most of the architectural blocks and remains had been repurposed as building material. So although the superstructure of the building was gone, it was actually excavated in the mid-19th century and again in the 1970s. The mid-19th century excavations were done by Charles Newton, who hauled off most of the sculpture to the British Museum. So if you go to the British Museum, you can see all the sculpture, but no real architecture. But what's interesting about that is it's kind of almost a blessing for architects, because what you have is an architectural palimpsest. You have Renaissance reconstructions and drawings, you have sources, but you don't have a building that you actually have to be married to. And so because it was a very famous tall building, it's one of our tallest buildings that we know about from antiquity, it actually in some ways then becomes a very good model for a newfangled skyscraper. This visible pyramid not only was very striking, but it's actually also very functional. And I think that's important because one of the tensions we see with kind of more modern architects talking about these buildings is they don't like them. They think that they're cheating with historical styles. But one thing I think that's very interesting about this building, at least at the top of it, is it had a storage space, a water tank, archives and records, as well as part of the elevator's mechanics. So it also has actually a functional purpose as well as a symbolic purpose. Now, the building was clearly a great success because it starts getting copied almost immediately. And we can see this if we go to 26 Broadway with the Standard Oil building, or if we go to 195 Broadway, which is the AT&T, old AT&T building, one of the many old AT&T buildings. We're going to reference another one later in the talk. But you can see here the Mausoleum of Holly Carnassus tacked up as well here. So again, it kind of makes these buildings a little bit more interesting and noticeable because of the way that they step back and they have some space around them. So if you think about visually, you can actually see the tops a lot better. The building was so successful that of course it is also copied outside of New York City. And so I have a couple of examples here from the Midwest, but I think the Union Central Life Insurance Building, which was designed by Cass Gilbert in Cincinnati, is just kind of an interesting example because one of the goals here was to make Cincinnati a regional center for insurance. And so building an impressive building, also the one that kind of references New York City. Also, you have a celebrity architect, Cass Gilbert, speaks to both the potency of the form and the perhaps celebrity architect. But you can see it also, there's a version of it in Minneapolis and Chicago as well. The forms continue to have potency even in a kind of postmodern context. We can see at 60 Wall Street and the Museum of Jewish Heritage that there are still the columns being evoked here and then the step pyramid here as well. But I also think what's interesting is that the building had staying power and it became the kind of symbol, actually the logo, in fact, of the Bankers Trust building all the way until the 1980s. And it was used in advertising. So here you can see the complete banking service, the Bankers Trust Company, and it's a tower of strength. And so this idea that in fact the building shows how strong and how successful, in fact, the Bankers Trust was, you could put your money safely with there. So the building had literally become a symbol of honesty and the dependability of the Bankers Trust Company, giving physical form to an abstract idea. Now, not only do we have buildings that are used for financial purposes, but of course, we also have civic skyscrapers. And so I am going to stay still in Lower Manhattan. I'm just going to go a little bit further north towards City Hall and just past City Hall to the David and Dinkins Municipal Building, formerly the Manhattan Municipal Building. This building, which was finished, I think, in 1914, was really built as a result of the great need to have more bureaucratic space to support the bureaucracies that were needed after New York City was incorporated into the greater New York City of all 5 boroughs, not just the independent cities. And so what I find interesting about this building is that we can look for classical influences on the top and on the bottom. And so let's start with the lower part. I should say this is a McKim-Mead in white building. Actually, this is a version of the skyscraper that they submitted for Grand Central Terminal for when they submitted their design contest, which they did not win there. And so it's interesting to me that it kind of got repurposed and used here. And so I'm going to talk about this lower area here, the entrance, and I'm also going to talk about the top, which you can see here first. So to me, the entrance is very striking because, again, we are looking at something that's modeled on the Arch of Constantine. So you can see there are certain motifs that get used and used again. So certain buildings that become a little bit more iconic. But what's interesting here is you have New Amsterdam, you have Manhattan, and you have New York. So kind of charting the history of the city, also kind of Manhattan's centrality. What here is interesting that we see, this is in a tabula ansata, which is a type of, basically it's like a Roman sign. And so this is one of the things that would either have an inscription or would have a painting that were often paraded in Roman triumphs, but we also see them throughout Roman art. So even down to the details, we have a lot of classical elements. Now, when we go a little bit even more into the details, we see that there are victories here in each corner. We have a female and a male. Usually victories are almost always female, so it's a little surprising. But we also have civic duty and civic pride. So it's also seeming to underscore kind of this idea that, in fact, everyone who's going into the building is kind of doing their part for New York. We have a good functioning bureaucracy, which some of us might doubt having done anything in New York City. But that said, this is the ideals behind it. So it's also a kind of very clever solution to moving people and cars in and out of spaces. So if we just go back and look for a second, now today there are cars going through, but you can walk all behind this colonnade. So it actually is it gives it a much more attractive facade, but it's also a highly functional one as well. So again, because skyscrapers are always having conversations really in 2 places, they're having the skyscraper conversation on the ground and then also in the sky as well. So this building is clearly talking to anyone who walks by. You can spend time looking at it, but we have civic duty here and civic pride. So those 2 forms, those personifications, are also mimicked with what is on top of the building, which is civic fame. So many of you guys, if anyone's ever on the Brooklyn Bridge or driving on the FDR or over in Brooklyn or Queens, you can always see civic fame. She is modeled on the model Audrey Munson, who was the model for many different sculptures. It's by A Weinman, who was actually the sculptor who did the sculptures on Penn Station and many other buildings, including like the Leeds tomb that's up in Woodlawn Cemetery, a very famous German-American sculptor. But this is also, again, it's not only we have a female classical personification, but she's resting on the adaptation of a classical building, and that is the Choreic monument of Lysicrates. So this is a monument from Athens from 335 to 334 BCE. Lysicrates was a choreagos, and that's a patron of musical performances. So basically he hosted and paid for a musical competition in the late 4th century BCE in Athens. And he erected the monument to celebrate the first prize winner in his competition. Now, this is a building that was really well known because it was published in the Antiquities of Athens, a 4-volume publication that was published from 1762 to 1812. And so it was something that we see. Now, if you're walking around Manhattan, you can see this in other places too, particularly on the west side. You can see it at the San Remo, but probably most importantly or most prominently, if you're in Riverside Park along Riverside Drive, the Soldiers and Sailors Monument in Manhattan is a very large version of this. So I don't know if I actually went by it on Memorial Day, and there were flowers out and servicemen remembering those who had been lost at the monument. And so it was a kind of really interesting thing to see. So this building can be on top of a skyscraper, on top of a tall apartment building, or can also be a monument in its own right. But it's again a way to show how ancient forms can be incredibly flexible. Now, from here, we again kind of moving forth, we have again a little bit of a nexus of classicism. And so John Ritter, who's at NYU, has really written extensively about Foley's Square. So I'm only going to touch briefly on it because his work is, I think, really the best to look at. But as you can see here, there are a series of classical buildings that basically utilized ancient forms here. And for me, what was the interesting one is the now Thurgood Marshall courthouse, which you see right here. This is also a Cass Gilbert building, and it's not too dissimilar from the Bankers Trust building. Yes, we have a different roof, but we still have the Ionic colonnade and we have the shaft. But what I find striking and very kind of interesting is the colonnade here. And this says United States Courthouse. And I think it kind of impresses upon people the solemnity and the kind of duty of upholding the law. And so there are a series of roundels here that are modeled on ancient coins, and they show Demosthenes, they show Plato, I think Aristotle, and then Moses. And what's interesting about that is that showing the classical world and the ancient world and the Christian world kind of commingled. Because sometimes there's a tension, particularly in the early 19th century, between the ancient world, which is undoubtedly very pagan, and the Christian world. Could Christians use these forms on their buildings or for their tombs without, questioning their forms? And so I think what's interesting here is you have these integrations of kind of two very important law-giving traditions, Moses and the classical world together, just in kind of small details here. Now, not only should lawyers and judges kind of go into this building in a serious and somber way, but it just speaks to the importance of law and the rule of law here. Now, from this building, I want to take us and go further north. And I want to go to Midtown because that's, of course, where many skyscrapers are located. And I want to talk about one of my favorite buildings, which draws upon really a series of different motifs and traditions from the ancient world. And that is the Fred French building, located on 45th and 5th Avenue. Fred French was famous for his co-op plans and also for, of course, for Tudor City. So after Grand Central Terminal was finished, the whole area kind of north and to the east of Grand Central, which had been fairly undesirable before that, really became desirable real estate. So he built Tudor City, which is to the east, and he put his own headquarters in this building, which he called the Fred French building or the French building, on 5th and 45th. Now, what's interesting about this building is that it draws very strongly on the motifs of the ancient Near East, but also on certain elements of the classical world here. Now, it was finished, it was built between 1925 and 1927. So it's built after the change in zoning laws. So you can start to see here some of the step backs going back because buildings had to start to do setbacks. So it also can't use a lot of historicizing sculpture and projections. I should note that it's interesting. I think the Bankers Trust building, it doesn't have a lot of sculpture on it. So it's using architectural forms rather than necessarily all of the personifications. But the Fred French building also is a little bit different because it uses polychrome tiles extensively on its building. So what's interesting about this is how the architects conceived of it and also how they described it. So Fred French's in-house architect, H. Douglas Ives, worked with the firm of Sloan and Robertson as the consulting architects to design the project. And Ives noted that they wanted to freely, or they felt they might freely adapt these Assyrian or Chalcedonian forms of ornament, which were particularly suited to the flat surfaces of the French building. I will note that none of these forms are actually Assyrian, but the idea that the architecture and the tile work of the ancient Near East were appropriate is very striking. For his design, Ives also referenced the polychrome, quote unquote, Tower of Seven Planets, which is another name for the Tower of Babel, and observed that the step backs could have gardens planted, so it would be like the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. So his way of thinking about the building, which he is very much couched in the ideas of the ancient Near East and in the architecture of the ancient Near East. He, in fact, calls it Mesopotamian. And what's interesting is we have really good archaeological evidence for where he could have gotten some of his inspiration. And those are the colored tiles that were iconic and essential parts of many of the palace architecture of the ancient Near East. So here I have the Ishtar Gate, which is from Babylon. The Ishtar Gate was re-erected in Berlin. It was dug by the Germans in the late 19th century into the 20th century in a series of excavations. And they basically took most of it back to Germany. But here's an example. Should you be going to the Met, you can see the Neo-Babylonian lion is in the Met. I think he's back. He was visiting the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World before the pandemic, and I can't remember if he got back or not, or if he's still at ISAW, which is, I think, on 84th Street. But you can see that there's this really, really bright polychrome tradition. And I think one of the things that's important to think about is that, in fact, the ancient world, whether it's the classical world, the Egyptian world, the ancient Near East, it is a world of technicolor. It is a polychrome world. The white sculpture was all painted. The marble was all painted. And so the fact that they took color and embraced it in this building here is very striking. It makes the building's top very different from many of the other skyscrapers that were around it. And they also look to the symbolism of the ancient Near East and the classical world. So here you can see griffins. Now, griffins, you may say, hey, we get those from medieval Europe. They're in, heraldic symbols, and people have them on signet rings or whatever. The answer is those originate in the ancient Near East, and they come into Greek art and then make their way progressively to the West. So we have griffins. We also have this amazing sunburst, and then we have bees. And we have two beehives, which we can see there. Bees, since the time of Virgil, the Roman poet who penned, I shouldn't say penned really, but wrote, or should say dictated, the Aeneid, which is kind of the Roman national epic that's under Augustus, the kind of Roman equivalent of the Odyssey and the Iliad. He also wrote a series of poems, a group of which is called the Georgics, which are all about farming. And he writes about bees and how hardworking they are and how industrious they are. And that basically, bees are such good little hard workers. So you also can see where the top of the building is conveying an idea about hard work and industry. This is also complemented with the figure that you can see here on the end, which is Mercury. It's very hard to make him out. It's hard to get good pictures of this building, but he's on that side there. Mercury, of course, makes lots of sense on a commercial or a financial building because he is the god of trade and commerce. Probably more of you would know him from being on the south side of the facade of Grand Central Terminal, where he sits with the Tiffany clock. With Hercules and Minerva as well. The other thing that's interesting to note here is today, of course, these could hide a lot of the necessary infrastructure. So the top of the building, though, really kind of makes a certain statement. It was also lit up at night, and so it would have been very visible. So the building really would have been very impressive and interesting to see at night as well. So it's again this reminder that the tops of the buildings, of course, have conversations with other ones. Now, this also, in terms of kind of, I'd say, very bright decoration is also replicated or echoed in the two lobbies on 45th Street and on 5th Avenue. This is now a Tommy Bahama store, so it's all just very glitzy, but it's a really wonderful and interesting facade to look at. So you can see where certain sculptural forms work very well flattened. And so here, not only do we have Mercury here, and we have a personification holding the bees here, but we have Lamassu, and we also have Pegasus. So here's the Lamassu. These are kind of bearded either lions or bulls. You can see two of them in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in the galleries of the ancient Near East, but they are put here and they are decorated. So the other thing is nobody had really ever used a lot of these motifs. The only other building that has Lamassu, to my knowledge, in New York City is the Pythian Temple on the Upper West Side. And that does have Lamassu on it, but those are the only two buildings. So nobody else is using any of these forms, and they actually work really well being flattened out against the facade. So it works well with the requirements that we have. But when you go into the lobby, Ives has also used all of these different motifs that we find in the ancient Near East. We have the kind of crow-stepped crenolons, which we find in a lot of architecture. We also have these double bull capitals from Susa, which there are examples in the Louvre. These also made an appearance in some of the Lobster Palaces. Those are kind of the over-the-top glitzy restaurants that were very popular at the turn of the 20th century. We have those in the Café de l'Opéra. But also the thing that's quite striking is this idea and emphasis on polychrome really continues in here as well. So it's a very impressive building. And what's interesting is in some ways this building marks a transition, and the transition from going from kind of the historical styles that are very clearly historical styles to something that's moving towards, I would say, a little bit more abstraction and more towards the Proto-Art Deco. But it's a building that's like no other. And so I think the reason why I talk about the neo-antique is because I want to be able to understand how the ideas and approaches of the architects are doing similar things, but using different models and different ideas. That, you know, that Fred French can have a building that looks to the Tudor style as well as to the ancient Near East and have no problem doing that and having both buildings be very successful. He actually put the building on the Voice, which was his kind of company newsletter, and the building was filled up with tenants very quickly thereafter. The actual interiors, when you go up into the building from the time, did not have any of the Neo-Assyrian or ancient Near Eastern motifs in any way, but it was really more on the exterior. So unsurprisingly, though, these historical styles went very much out of favor as the 20th century progressed. But we can still see echoes of the classical world in certain more modern buildings. And this is where I'm moving out of my depth. But through some conversations with colleagues who work on later architecture, I was tempted to do so. So modern architects relegated the anthropomorphic versions of industry and commerce, many of these personifications that we see on buildings, to history, because they kind of thought they were not that meaningful anymore. But some of the fundamental principles of classical architecture, which emphasized proportion, ratio, and order, emerged as critical elements of the design and thought process of certain leading modernists. Le Corbusier, for example, was drawn to and inspired by the rationalism and proportional principles of classical architecture, which informs some of his most important works like the Villa Savoy. I mean, we know he was interested actually and visited ancient villas in France. He even compared modern machines to the Parthenon and pictured them together in his Vers tun un architecture. Nowhere is this kind of interest, I think, in modern interest in ancient forms more apparent than in the masterful Seagram building, located at 375 Park Avenue and designed by Mies with the assistance of Philip Johnson and constructed between 1956 and 1958. Designed by Mies at the behest of Phyllis Lambert, the building was the headquarters for the Seagrams Company, which was Canada's largest distilling and liquor distributing, run by the Bronfman family and Phyllis Lambert's father. And it was designed, again, to be an example of a building that was very modern, very impressive, and would show off, you know, kind of the prestige of Seagram's. And Lewis Mumford, who has many snarky things to say about many of the buildings that I love, of course, called it the Rolls Royce of architecture. But I think what's interesting is that we can see from a classical perspective, I can see certain aspects, I think, of the design that draws on the principles of classical architecture, which that Mies had long embraced. In some ways, the solution is very simple. Mies had developed and deployed a proportional system of 3 to 5 bays to form his elegant tower. In some ways, it also strikes me as being a lot like a Roman temple because it is set back 100 feet from the edge of Park Avenue. Lambert even noticed that, and she said, his ingenious and deceptively simple solution is comparable to the use of the Greek orders. And so I was thinking about, you know, when one walks up here, not only do you have this feeling of walking to a space and coming up, but you have to go through these kind of, these 4 pillars kind of here to go into the building, which to me feels a lot like going into a Tetris style. That means a 4-pillared space and thing along that. And so the other thing is that this has been noticed by other architectural historians as well. Franz Schultz noted that, quote, the very axiality of the plan underscored by the centrally hung entrance canopy lent a psychic formality to the act of the entry as if one were entering a classical edifice. And so I think what's interesting here is that even if you reject the classicizing forms in an overt way or the historicizing sculpture, these fundamental aspects that originated in classical architecture, ideas about kind of proportion and ratio, those ideas endure and exist because they're just very simply put good building principles. So the architects and owners of New York's commercial, financial, and civic architecture consistently appropriated ancient forms in the 19th and early 20th century. And I think, as I hope that I've argued and convinced you, these ancient forms worked very well for small banks and civic buildings, but then also for tall towers as well. And this is because in many ways, these buildings could convey what the owners wanted them to say, that a building was solid, trustworthy, and it would endure, and you should have confidence in the building or the building's owner. So for the banker trust, you could trust them. They were, in fact, a tower of strength. While we could also say that Mercury on top of the Fred French building helped spread the Fred French plan. And so I think what you would start to see is that New Yorkers understood that ancient forms could mean strength, status, and success. And even though these forms gave way to more abstract ones, these ideas have continued and persisted to today. So here we see 550 Madison Avenue, which was the AT&T building, then the Sony building, and I think now might be coming condos. I lost track of what the building is having. It has a broken pediment. And people could say that that broken pediment type of architecture originates actually in the Hellenistic world in Alexandria. We see examples of it in Palmyra, in Syria, and then we also see examples of it in Rome. But here it's taken and totally abstracted to be the interesting top of a building as well. And so what I guess I'd like to end with is that, in a sense, antiquity remains important to all of these buildings and to the architectural story and history of New York, even in its more abstract and modern forms. Thank you.
Oh, Lizzie, thank you. That was a whirlwind tour of certainly of the classical world and as applied to New York. Chip, I would love to stand back and let you carry on the conversation, but maybe as a prompt, let me ask you, as someone for whom I think my interpretation is that where classicism is a deeply held belief by you personally, if you want to comment on this, the kind of the range of applications or languages or vernaculars of classicism or antiquity, and how you think that was practiced in New York across the decades of the early 20th century and indeed up to a time when it's translated into modernism.
Well, first, let me say to Lizzie how much I appreciate and enjoyed your talk. And it seemed to me that we look at these things as styles or as chronologies or as forms or as systems. The system of classicism is a compositional form. But you were looking at it in a different way that kind of puts all the forms together in a basket and then looks at the mix that comes out of it. It's a kind of an eclecticism. Do you think this is a kind of non-chronological eclecticism that you're describing in your book and your talk?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to describe it, our kind of bricolage of different ideas. And I think sometimes there are buildings that are purposely very more spot on, like, and really are, if you will, kind of true, which I'm not sure is actually the way I like to think about it. But I think in a lot of cases, it's kind of like, okay, we're trying to achieve, if you have a new type of building you're building, then in some ways to look to different historical styles that you can kind of bring together and say, okay, this aspect works well for here and this one works well for here. I'm going to create something new with that. I think then that is actually a creative process in itself, because so often, and I think probably this gets leveled at classic buildings that are much more purely classical than, say, like the Fred French building, which has a lot going on, which is that they're pastiches. And that's kind of a negative thing, where I look at it the other way, that I think it's part of this very creative process. And particularly for like Americans and maybe for New York, like we're always we're always reinventing the past. We're always looking to the past to also sometimes define what the present and the future will be. And so I think as New York's trying to figure out what it wants to do with its architecture, and that's kind of, it sounds like as if there's like a puppeteer doing things, but the different people want to do different things. And so sometimes different architecture and putting them together allows different architects and patrons and tastemakers to really create interesting different things that you would never find anyplace else. I mean, I only look at certain buildings and I'm talking to another archaeologist or classicist and we're like, dude, that's weird. But it's only because we have that background and training. And so it becomes this really kind of, for me, it's also a bit of a project of the history of archaeology. What do people actually know? Like, how do they know what things look like, or what are their sources? Because from an archaeologist to go, well, that's not right. That totally misses the point. Like, did they read Stewart and Rivette, or had they seen the description of Egypt? Where is it coming from? Okay, and that tells you then also about the intellectual culture and climate of the United States and New York City at that moment. And I think that's interesting in terms of, you know, the development of the city's kind of intellectual life and cultural life as well.
But so many of the, since we're talking about the 19th and 20th century, it's in the wake of both neoclassicism, 18th century European neoclassicism, and the Beaux-Arts, which was the training ground for so many of these architects. And both of those notions of classicism really relied on an idea, a systemic idea, that it wasn't a collage so much as it was an iterative, reiterative development of forms that were taken from antiquity. So when you're showing the municipal building, David Dinkins building, and of course it does harken back to the choreagic monument of Lysicrides, but it also harkens back to innumerable tholos form buildings that the Romans that proliferated under the Romans, and then on and on and on. You know, the Wren's steeples, and you know, it's over and over and over again. And so I guess the question is this really new, fusing together familiar forms, adapted or not, to new purposes? It seems to me that's the story of classical architecture.
Well, I'd say in some ways, nothing is ever new. You know, there's always something that goes before that you can borrow and adapt. I think what maybe is interesting about certain ones that are, you know, I think your point is well taken on the top of the municipal building, because also those European intermediaries, and I didn't emphasize this perhaps as much as I do in the book, which is it's a really important thing. Like the Soldiers and Sailors Arch in Brooklyn, you can't have that without, even if it's very much modeled on the Arch of Titus, you can't have that without the Arc de Triomphe. And part of it, particularly the sculptural groups, and you have, you know, Frederick MacMonnies living in France, you know, creating all of these things. So that European refraction is a really important thing. And I think that's part of New York's kind of goal of trying, there's a real rhetoric with some of these buildings, or from the architects, of trying to show that we are as culturally sophisticated in terms of our art and architecture as the Europeans. And I think about that actually in the case of those Lobster Palaces, which are these, you know, you may know them, these kind of over the top, totally wacky restaurants that use everything going. It's a place you go after you've gone to the theater and you're a gentleman of a certain means and you take your mistress, la 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 la. But there's one that's called Murray's Roman Gardens, and there's a publicity piece. That's what survives, and actually that's where most of a lot of the photos of the building, which no longer exists, come from. And it's this whole rhetoric that you could not leave New York and see all the architecture of the ancient world, and it would be better here. So I think it's also part of New York engaging in this process of kind of having culture and that conversation that goes on at this point in time, really largely with Europe. So I think that's an important thing, but also some of the other buildings that aren't skyscrapers, they do look to ancient forms in ways that aren't filtered through Europe. So like I'd say the distributing reservoir in Murray Hill that's under New York Public Library, that's modeled, that they pull those motifs from the description of Egypt, but there's no reservoir anyplace else in the world that looks like an Egyptian temple. And it's totally bizarre and wacky. So I think it almost a lot of times, particularly the classics, it is going through Europe, but I think sometimes with the Egyptian and the ancient Near Eastern, it may be a little bit less filtered simply because there is a big interest in Egyptomania and Egyptian things in Europe always and forever. But they sometimes it seems to be going more directly to the source. But also the Egyptian architecture is really, popular. It's most popular for non-funerary structures and funerary structures in the first part of the 19th century, but after the second half of the 19th century, it's much more funereal, as you well know. And so I think that may also have something to do with it. Sorry, that was a very long answer to your question.
But I think you pointed out in your book, the part of which I've read, that because the excavations in Egypt made things current at different times, then they begin to have different influences. But I think that the Europe as the intermediary of culture between the ancient world and the United States gets really mixed up and turned on its head when skyscrapers start to emerge as a uniquely, at least at the beginning, American form. And so your discussion of skyscrapers was very interesting to me. Both the French building with the discussion of griffins, which I think illustrates sculpturally the point I was trying to make about architecture developing iteratively through time. They're griffins from different places in different times. But you also see it in the Erechtheion, which you mentioned several times, where sometimes quite literally you'll find the caryatid porch, for example, in Buffalo at the Albright Knox Museum. But then you'll also find places where the doorways, the architraves around the doors and the columns and the details from the Erechtheion are adapted, sometimes quite subtly, to accommodate the new purposes that they're being put to. Do you think that there's a distinctively American interpretation of antiquity that comes along with this new scale that skyscrapers bring?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think in some ways, yes. I think the United States' engagement with antiquity has always been a little bit different from Europe's, and part of that is because of our rhetoric of democracy. And I think the Greek revival takes on a very particular meaning in large parts of the United States. But I think with the bankers, with some of these skyscrapers, it's a way to be very unique, but it's also like, haha, you have your classical buildings. We have them too, but ours are taller and ours are better. One thing I didn't talk about actually, because it wasn't in the book, I wasn't a way to get it in except in a footnote, is there was a delineator and illustrator named Hugh Ferris, who I'm sure probably you guys both know. But if you've ever looked at some of his books, he does these really interesting drawings, and he's also drawing in the ancient Near East because of the ziggurats and very tall buildings, but he doesn't like the fact that there are classical tops. He actually has kind of these farcical drawings where he's got the Parthenon on top of like a large plinth. So I guess that's a long way to say that I think America has a complex relationship with some of these forms, certainly, but he's drawing in the 1920s. But I think, yeah, it's a way of America saying, look, we have all this stuff and we're putting it on the newest, most impressive buildings that you people can't build the way we can build. And I think it's a way of New York, again, distinguishing itself from other cities as well. Although, because I think what's interesting, of course, is skyscrapers don't originate here. They come here, they become the defining feature. And then these buildings are getting replicated all over the United States. So I think I would agree with you. I think it is a very original American way of doing things.
Because you mentioned Hugh Ferris, I do have to chime in because, as a matter of fact, the first book that I published was the reprint of The Metropolis of Tomorrow, on which I spent about 2 years writing the essay at the beginning and then at the end that framed the work, that included some of the Mesopotamian and the hanging gardens of Babylon and a kind of romance about the antique world, but that was also informed by his collaborations with other architects especially Harvey Wiley Corbett, and I think the sesquicentennial celebration that never really came off very much very well in Philadelphia, but that had the Temple of Solomon, which was going to be recreated and burned a couple of times a day by gaslit flames in a kind of proto-Disneyland extravaganza. And my argument, which I think is relevant here because it takes us into the next period, not just Art Deco, but really modernism. And if you want to think of Art Deco as the machine age, that the modernism of the machine age, you mentioned Le Corbusier and towards new architecture, I guess, before. And it's really that tug between different definitions of modernism that begins a trajectory in the 1930s that we like to explain as the embrace of the European avant-garde. But I think what's really key about Hugh Ferris and these evocations of the classical world in these early drawings in especially around 1922 is that when Ferris engages with the idea with Corbett of the zoning envelope as an expression of pure sculptural mass, that kind of simplicity was the answer for many American architects of what is the appropriate form of expression for the skyscraper. It was an architecture of mass, it was simplicity, and the machine age kept moving towards a greater simplicity in massing that actually aligns so beautifully with classicism that in the 1930s, it could be a kind of modern classicism that takes over as in federal courthouses and everywhere else. So this tension between modernism and a kind of cacophony, I think, of classicism and the ancient world that you're identifying in the first decades of the 20th century, I think is it's a search by American architects, some of whom were still connected to classicism out of a deep held belief, some by a training in the Beaux-Arts, some out of a kind of, oh, what do we do now kind of confusion of how to deal with buildings that went, I'm just speaking of skyscrapers now because the style went much more broadly. But what about a building which is absolutely vertical when classicism is essentially horizontal? So, a decorative form of classicism was certainly a kind of reversion to practice where the search for a modern style was just cooking somewhere, waiting to come out in a new form. And you absolutely see that in Ferris when on a minute level of looking year by year of how his work changed, and it was in collaboration with other architects because he was rendering really on commission, working with others, that you see the transition from a world that embraced history for expression or communication, and one that was looking for a new form of meeting or identification.
I actually think it's a really interesting thing what you brought up because I think you're absolutely right. What I find interesting about the 19th century is that part of the United States and New York's kind of quest to show that it's modern and it's metropolis is to use ancient forms in its architecture in a lot of ways, or medieval architecture. And it's interesting that kind of in the United States, in New York's kind of quest to become more modern, it looks to the past to kind of define that. And then rightfully so, it kind of has a new type of building form that doesn't have any predecessors. And so the rejection of classical forms is a kind of natural, I mean, in some ways it's like a no-brainer. But it takes a while to happen. But I think it's interesting because it kind of speaks to this essential nature of New York to perpetually redefine what is modern and is always looking for new architectural forms and ways of thinking to kind of rethink what it means to be in the present. And so what I find striking is that the past was essential to doing that for a certain part. And then of course, the rejection of that is essential to move forward in the 20th century. And it just strikes me as it's then like, what is the next thing? Is it green building, what's moving forward for us in the 21st century as we look around our city, what types of parks, what types of spaces do we have that allows us to be a city that will deal with many challenges like climate change, in addition to a whole pandemic. And so I think that's a great way of phrasing this change that happens in the 20th century and sets us up well to think about what might happen in the 21st.
But the styles changed, and so I mean, it's interesting to me that people try to loop Mies van der Rohe into a narrative that emphasizes the classicism of the Seagram's building, which is, to my mind, pretty thin. And in the midst of this discussion about the development of zoning forms derived from zoning, one of the things that's interesting, Bob Stern refers to some of the Art Deco buildings as Mesoamerican mountains, and because they do indeed take from the ruins in Mesoamerica that were just coming to the fore at that time. I mean, they had been seen, but they were being studied for the first time. And there are some skyscraper tops that are remarkably similar to Tikal, stretched. This just goes to your point about the desire to connect to the past, to mine the past, to associate oneself with the past. That I think is, as I say, in the Seagram's building is pretty thin.
Well, I wouldn't say, I mean, the reason why I think the connection to the Seagram's building, or why I bring it up, is because I would never say it as a classical building in the way that other ones are, but it's this idea of maybe certain design principles that you could say are maybe so core that they're not even classical, but they come to the kind of tradition of architecture originally through the classical world, and those things persist. And so I just kind of wanted to add that on there as a way of maybe also pressing colleagues who are classicists to think a little bit about, just if it doesn't have a victory, doesn't mean it isn't somehow maybe connected to the classical world, because I think it's to challenge some of my colleagues to think more broadly about what the aftermath of the classical world is. And so it's just a way for me to think a little bit more broadly about some of the buildings that I naturally go, ooh, I don't even want to think about that. That's totally beyond my purview. But it was for me when I was looking at the, the 550 Madison building, where somebody says, oh, it's a bit like a Chippendale, and you start going back, and I go, well, I know where those forms come from, even as precursors. And we know that, people have publications of Baalbek in the 18th century. And so, of Wood's description. So we know that those ideas are there. We see them in Rome as well, where they would have been much better known. And so part of me goes, well, that's kind of interesting as a top of a building as well.
But Johnson stole the Golden Boy from the top of the AT&T building to put in his lobby, which just, put some emphasis on the importance of sculptural embellishment, of representation, recognizable representation. The World building that was on Park Row, one of the really great early skyscrapers in New York, had at the top of it the Telemon that had been stolen from the Hermitage, which had been stolen from Argos, from the Olympian in Agrigento. And that's a really creative use of that sculptural form, those men holding up great weight in all three cases, so expressively and so differently in all three cases.
Well, and that actually makes me immediately think then of the other figure who has to hold up, well, not the world, the astrolabe, which is Rockefeller in Rockefeller Center, and Atlas, who of course looks much more Art Deco than his counterpart, Prometheus, who's floating down as a kind of classical god. And that idea of kind of holding the weight of the world, which in some ways perhaps is like Rockefeller, underwriting at tremendous cost, building the structure in the Great Depression, is an interesting way to think about it. But that's another building where you have interesting classical ornamentation. I shouldn't say building complex that you have that also has some of those things. So I think, but also the thing with the Telemons and also Atlases, as you said, it's like the strong men who hold up the world, which is a very kind of suitable way of thinking about tops of buildings or buildings that have to, if you will, hold up the world as well. So I think that's a great example to bring up as well.
Well, we have gone on longer than we should, beyond our hour, and I'm sure we could continue much longer with this discussion. But I do think, Lizzie, that Chip has given you a good topic for your next book, the amazingly prolific Lizzie Macaulay-Lewis, who produces a book or so a year. Now you can turn to Mesoamerican pyramids, and we'll point you to Francisco Mujica and also Alfred Bossum, who in the 1920s made that specific connection, along with wonderful plates, etchings and mezzotints, I think, of ancient pyramids, but also a city in the Neo-American style, as in Central American pyramids. So we'll look forward to that as a suggestion for at least a chapter or another lecture for another time. And thank you so much for this evening and for sharing this incredible exuberance, both of classical world motifs and forms, but certainly for your enthusiasm for all this. And thanks, Chip, too, for deepening our discussion for this evening. So everybody come back on June 21st, when Anne, which is unusually a Monday night for us, when Anne Buttenwieser will talk about her project for the floating swimming pool, and she is indeed the floating pool lady. So join us then, and thanks for this evening, and have a good night, everybody. Bye. Hello, welcome everyone. Welcome to the first of our June book talks. We have a second on June 21st that I'll mention before I hand the controls over to Lizzie Macaulay-Lewis, as in Elizabeth Macaulay-Lewis, who you see here on the screen. And I just want to spend a moment to introduce her, and also to tell you that we have a special guest for the discussion after the talk, Charles Warren, an architect, Chip Warren, who is a confirmed classicist and has written a number of articles in major studies of some of New York's leading classical architects, including Carrere and Hastings and others. So we thought that it would be interesting to engage in a discussion amongst three people, and especially those who are steeped in classicism, as I confess I am not, but Lizzie is doing us a special favor tonight for our Skyscraper Museum audience to really concentrate on some of New York's most delightful and serious classical skyscrapers, as well as other styles that she calls neo-antique. And I'm sure she will talk about this in her lecture, which will be about 40 minutes, and then we'll have the discussion. But I wanted to both introduce her and her book, which you see on the screen now, Antiquity in Gotham, Ancient Architecture of New York City, which follows another book that she spoke about at the Skyscraper Museum. I'll show you the cover in a moment. She is an extremely prolific author. This is her new book. I will go forward so that you can see her, not even her most recent book, but another one of a couple years ago, let's say, published in 2020, Classical Architecture in New York, where you can see one of our favorite skyscrapers, the RCA building, 30 Rockefeller Center, as the centerpiece of that classical ensemble of Rockefeller Center. So Lizzie is a New Yorker, is both an archaeologist of the ancient world and a New Yorker in spirit and in practice. She has participated in archaeological investigations in the ancient world that look at Roman housing, that look at Sephardic palaces, a whole range of cultures within the classical world that inform her scholarship of her specialty. But she also, as a professor at CUNY, where she is a professor in both Middle Eastern studies and in liberal studies. So she has the master's of liberal studies at CUNY, an interdisciplinary pursuit that brings together many different departments and opportunities to study. And Lizzie herself cuts across these various interests and centuries in finding, as in the subject of tonight's talk, finding in New York City the echoes of the classical world and of the world of the antique, and find meaning as well as presence in the multiplicity and the multicultural aspects of New York. So both in her scholarship in antiquity, which is broad, as well as the multiculturalism of and interdisciplinary pursuits in her academic work in New York City, she has brought a really enthusiastic, I can't say unique because many of us share these broad interests, but a really enthusiastic audience, which she has continued to inform through lectures like the one tonight, which is kind of fans out into a fourfold series or course that she's giving just now within these months at the 92nd Street Y. She's also spoken at Gotham Center. So she proselytizes for her discipline and her subject matter in many ways. I think I should allow her to share her enthusiasm now, and you can see already on the screen Lizzie Macaulay-Lewis, and so I'm going to hand the screen over to her and let her take you on a tour of classicism in New York. Oh, Lizzie, one second before you do share your screen, I neglected to go on to the additional slides, a book cover of your Housing the New Romans, and covers of a pair of books for which Chip Warren, our discussant for tonight, is an author, one on Carrera and Hastings, and other the monuments, the monumental and landscape architecture of Woodlawn Cemetery. And I did want to also mention and show you the cover of the other title that we were going to feature in our June series. And if you go to our website, you'll see July as well, where there are a couple where we take you to Moscow and well, actually back to the Seagram Building Plaza in wide-ranging talks. But on June 21st, Ann Buttenwieser will talk about her project of some 20 years or more to accomplish a floating swimming pool in New York City, one that can be enjoyed today and this summer from Beretta Point, I believe, in the Bronx. At least that's where it was last year. So Anne will recount the quixotic enterprise of creating a floating pool in New York City. So now, Lizzie, you can share your screen and we will go on to your talk, and I'll come back later.